The St. Charles County Veterans Museum is a 501c3 nonprofit business. The museum would not exist without the donations of our generous community. Your donations ensure the museum continues to share and preserve the stories of our veterans. Would you like to be part of something special? To donate, visit sccvetsmuseum.org and click on Donate. The Dog Tag Podcast may at times cover sensitive topics including, but not limited to, suicide, abuse, violence, severe mental illness, sex, drugs, and alcohol addiction. You are advised to refrain from watching or listening to the Dog Tag Podcast if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. Neither the company, host, director, or guests shall at any time be liable for the content covered, causing offense, distress, or other reaction. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only. The primary purpose of the Dog Tag Podcast is to educate. The views, information, or opinions expressed on the Dog Tag Podcast are solely the views of the individuals or guests involved and by no means represent absolute facts. The Dog Tag does not accept responsibility for their views or comments. This podcast is sponsored by the Renee Esri Allstate Agency located here in O'Fallon, Missouri. She is licensed in Missouri and Illinois and focuses on your personal and commercial insurance needs. Her office is located at 2764 Highway K, O'Fallon, Missouri 63368. She can be reached at 636-379-9556 or by email at reneeessry@allstate.com, reneeessary@allstate.com. If you are shopping for insurance and want an active agent that will educate and advise you on the coverage you need, reach out to her. Welcome to the Dog Tag Podcast from the St. Charles County Veterans Museum with your host, Jason Galvin and Jim Higgins. Today in studio, we have Pat Swinger, O'Fallon historian and author. Jim, go ahead and kick us off.
Welcome, Pat.
Thank you.
One of the things that fascinates me about the area is St. Charles County specifically, but O'Fallon, St. Peter's, and all the communities around here is the colorful history of the area. I like to tell a lot of our guests, we have guests come into the museum from all across the country, and I like to tell them this was the Wild West not too many years back. I mean, nothing really went on west of the Mississippi, right?
Right.
And you know, and it's the early settlers had a great influence on this area. Many of them were from Kentucky, and we had Spanish, we had French, and the German influence. Can you talk a little bit about those early settlers?
Well, I guess the relevant history begins really in the early 1800s, where there was a huge influx of Germans to the area. Of course, the Zumwalts were already here, and the Boones from the Kentucky and Virginia region. But the German influence came when a man named Godfrey Duden came to this country, went back to Germany, his homeland, and published a book in 1829 that extolled the virtues of this area, its fertile lands, its beautiful countryside, rolling hills, and, of course, its freedom, where a man could have a plot of land and feed his own family from it, not somebody else's family. And so, as a result, the German immigration then just went through the roof. And we sort of make a joke out of this, that O'Fallon is a German town with an Irish name. And I'll explain that later if we talk about John O'Fallon. There was a Native American population here at one point that actually just vanished, and we don't know exactly when that happened. It's almost as mysterious as, what happened in Cahokia. It was primarily Sauk and Fox, Native Americans, and that's where the Black Hawk story comes from, relating to Jacob Zumwalt. So We have evidence that the Zumwalts were familiar with Native American culture and made acquaintance with them once they were here. So it's an interesting story.
So we have the Germans come in that were abolitionists. They were anti-slavery.
Correct.
And the early settlers were more pro-slavery, were they not?
Right. Well, these are the people who moved here from the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky. And, of course, they brought their Southern culture with them. So we did have a miniature Civil War thing going on in that the Germans who settled not only in Augusta but then north of the O'Fallon area and west, and then we had the southern section that intertwined in the Augusta area, actually, but then in O'Fallon itself, the Zumwalts and then the Healds were Southerners.
So we kind of had these two cultures that were kind of going along, coexisting for many years, and then we got somewhere closer to the Civil War, things boiled over a little bit because, I mean, Missouri was, I guess there was a decision to be made. I mean, St. Louis, St. Charles, and,
Right.
and this area, right?
Yes, there was. The Heald family that bought the Zumwalt plantation or Zumwalt farm in 1817, they always referred to that property as a plantation. And they brought a plantation system and mentality with them from Kentucky, actually.
And, one of the things that I read about the area, Arnold Krekel, I guess, was, it sounds like he was staunchly against slavery and had a lot to do with preserving this area for the Union.
Yes, he did, and he carried that on through the rest of his life. Now, oddly enough, as the Civil War broke out, Arnold Krekel did in fact own one slave himself, which he promptly freed. Now, we have to think in terms of the economic realities of those days before we persecute anybody for owning slavery. In my mind, we are all live in our own age as best we know how to. But it was always told that Frankie Price, who was Jacob Zumwalt's second wife, owned a slave at the time of their marriage, and family lore has it, of course that's not always accurate, but family lore has it that Jacob forced her to sell that slave. And in fact, there is record of her selling a slave at that early point. But the Healds, as the Civil War went on and bubbled over, some of the members of that family actually formed a militia unit with the intention of marching with Sterling Price, heading south. And you mentioned Arnold Krekel, who is the brother of the man who is attributed with the founding of O'Fallon, Nicholas Krekel. But Arnold Krekel formed a militia. It was called Krekel's Deutsch, Deutsch, German, okay? Their primary job, though, was to protect the railroad, the supply lines. But they purportedly held a raid on Fort Zumwalt during Darius Heald's ownership of the property. Darius Heald was imprisoned in Gratio Prison for a very short time. He was a wealthy enough man that he was able to write a very nice check that not only got him out of prison, but got him out of service for the duration of the war. And he later pledged his allegiance to the Union. In the process of that raid, Darius Heald's father, Nathan Heald's sword from the War of 1812 was stolen. It was later found in a corn crib in a neighboring farm, and it is now in the Fort Dearborn Museum near Chicago.
Many Revolutionary War veterans settled in this area in the early 1800s. Just about a mile from here, we have a War of 1812 fort, Fort Zumwalt. It was designed to protect the local families from Indian raids. What can you tell us about the fort, and go from there?
Well, thanks. I mean, I am just so proud of being a member of the O'Fallon Community Foundation and the work we did to reconstruct that fort as exact as possible. Several archaeological digs guaranteed that the footprint is precisely where Jacob built it. Jacob Zumwalt and 3 of his brothers served during the Revolutionary War between 17... let me see. I got some notes here. I don't get these dates right all the time. In the 1779-81 era. But they only served about 3 months out of the year, like a lot of soldiers at that time. The reality was they had to go home and harvest, plant the crops, whatever. Those were the realities. And their service was not so much in an infantry capacity as it was as scouts and spies, quite frankly. And that, again, speaks to their relationship and familiarity with the Native American population, that they were able to serve as scouts. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's fascinating to think about that, but I never knew that the Revolutionary War guys, that they took time off.
I didn't know that either.
Farming the crops there.
Yeah.
I've heard there's roughly about 31 Revolutionary War veterans buried nearby here, and some of the old names of the county, Cottle, and some of those names come from here.
Right.
But so our names, the other thing I wanted to mention here is it was built as a fort to defend against the Indians in the War of 1812.
Right.
But I don't think it was ever attacked.
No, it wasn't attacked, and it wasn't a military outpost either. It was, for many years we referred to it as Fort Zumwalt, and we still do. And the truly accurate way would be to just call it Zumwalt's Fort, because it was just a homestead fort, actually. It was a fairly large log home for its time. And so the expression is that under threat of Indian attack, neighboring families would fort up for mutual protection. Anecdotally, we've always been told that there was a stockade fence around it so that as many as 10 families could camp there. Archaeologically, we never could find evidence of a stockade fence, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. That it was built in several stages, but Jacob Zumwalt had a Spanish land grant. Like a lot of people who served, especially the backwoods folk who served during the Revolutionary War, they won the war against the English, okay, but now they're being taxed by their own government, and that did not set well. And so they just moved on to the frontier farther. So
I guess the fear of the Indian attack, part of it comes from, you mentioned, was it Michigan up in Saginaw?
Yes.
The family that was up there actually did experience an Indian attack. So when they relocated down to here, they were afraid of that, I guess, and that's why they built the fort here, right?
Well, no. Now the fort was prior to that. Okay. Jacob's fort was built in the 1800, give or take. His land grant is dated 1798. The attack you're referring to was the Heald family. Captain Nathan Heald was commander of Fort Dearborn at the outbreak of the War of 1812. His wife, Rebecca Heald, her maiden name was Wells. She was the daughter of Samuel Wells, who, by the way, fought with John O'Fallon at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Oh. Yeah. So during that Fort Dearborn massacre, by Potawatomi Indians. Nathan Heald was severely wounded. Rebecca was severely wounded, several arrow wounds, several gunshot wounds. They did manage to, and they were taken prisoner by the Indians, but they did manage to negotiate their release. They went back to Kentucky to recover for a while, and then they moved westward. Nathan Heald and Rebecca Heald, his wife, purchased the Fort Zumwalt property in 1817 for $1,000, and it was like 330 some acres.
Well, there's a number of historic buildings just a short walk from here. Namely, there's a black one-room schoolhouse near here. Can you kind of tell us about some of these historical buildings and maybe specifically about that one?
That one, yes. That was a school built for African-American children. Sondran Street was known as, the African-American community referred to it as the Hill. And it was, well, even when I was a child in the 50s, it was a street loaded with shanties, to be perfectly blunt. We don't know exactly when that school was built. There are no records on it necessarily. We have only one photo of it originally. It sits on the northwest corner of Sondran and East Elm. I think it's an ice cream shop now. But in 1949, the one-room schoolhouse in O'Fallon for O'Fallon proper public school children, they had outgrown it. And so they tore that building down and built a larger brick schoolhouse, which still stands today, by the way, at the corner of School Street and West Pittman. And in the process, they needed some place to go with the school children from the O'Fallon Public School. So unfortunately, the sad part of this tale is that the black children were simply taken out of that building so that the white public school children could attend school there. And they were given a choice of going either to Wentzville or St. Charles to go to school. It's not a pretty part of our history, but it is what it is.
So there's another building that I had learned about and kind of preparing for this. There was the Woodlawn Institute for Young Women. Now, I knew there was a street named Woodlawn, and
yes.
I don't think the building is there anymore. Is that where that building used to be? And that was Darius that founded that? Or?
Darius is one of the principals in founding it, yes. And it stood near the old, what we now call Old Woodlawn, across from Fort Zumwalt Square. That's approximately where it stood. And it was an offshoot of an earlier school called Fairview that was out in Warrenton. Yes, Darius was a principal in that. And in fact, we have some early pictures that shows the kitchen help of Woodlawn Institute. And they're all African American, and it would be easy to make the assumption that they may well have been the freed slaves of Darius Heald.
Well, what's interesting about it is you've got this, like the page was turned in the area right at the end of the Civil War when they were freed. We have a black cemetery that was terribly neglected for many, many years, and it's now much better shape. But isn't it for the most part slaves that are buried there?
Well, slaves and descendants of slaves. Let's put it that way, because there are more recent burials there. There is, I believe, one Cherokee Native American buried there. But yes. And there's questions as to where that got its name. It may have been from a pastor, because there were on that street called the Hill, Sondren, there were 3 different churches. So it was a very active church community. And one of the preachers was purportedly named Sage. But I've always heard, too, that it came from the sage fields that grew along Sondren Street. So, who knows, right? There's some questions that just are going to remain unanswered.
Sure. And that's what's funny about the area. I think, we went to a trip in France, and when you're over there, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and we're having trouble remembering history here in the States that go back 200 years.
That's true. I had the same experience in Ireland. We think a building is old as if it's 100 years old, and that's just getting started. The ivy's just starting to grow over there.
and it's kind of sad because, it almost feels like we don't preserve our history well. I mean, certainly when you look at Sage Chapel Cemetery, there was a lot of slaves in around the area.
Yes.
And they were freed. They went elsewhere, but it is part of the heritage here that we don't know very well. But the other, after around the time of the Civil War, I guess shortly before that, this area is known as the crossroads of the Midwest. Wentzville makes that claim, but we're not that far from there. Right. And a railroad really opened up the area, didn't it?
It did. I mean, you could make the argument that we're a railroad town. Arnold Krekel, well, the Krekel family came over in 1832. Arnold is the eldest son, and some of this is just my theory. It's not documented anywhere. Arnold, being the eldest son, was educated, all right, and he became a country solicitor. He was also a surveyor. He managed to purchase the land on the just north of where the railroad tracks are now, and I suppose as an associate of John O'Fallon's, who was president of the railroad at that time. Said, hey, if you'll run a railroad through this area, we'll name the depot after you. Because there was a debate which route the railroad should go in. Should it take the northern route or go a little south through the Augusta area? Well, the Augusta area is geographically posed more challenge. So they took this route. And in fact, Nicholas Krekel, the younger brother of Arnold, then became depot agent, postmaster. He opened a general store. So, my theory has always been that Arnold was, in part at least, providing an opportunity for a less advantaged younger brother.
And speaking of Nicholas, his home still stands today, correct? And
yes, it does.
Where is that located at?
That's on the northwest corner of Main and what is now Civic Drive. It was at the time or earlier called Front Street.
Mm-hmm. And that's privately held. That's not, the city doesn't own that. Right?
No, I don't know what the actual ownership is right now. I think the city did purchase it at one time, but I believe the bridal shop owner owns that now. I'm not sure of his name. I believe it's Orff, but I'm not sure. Now, that wasn't the original structure. The original structure was a log structure, really just a one-room structure, and it was added on over the years. There's at the time the city purchased it, they did remove enough of the floorboards that we could see the large logs in the floor joists and so forth. It was pretty impressive. Nice to see.
And he gave permission to the railroad they could cross his land, and suggested that there was a railroad depot, and that kind of really opened up the immigration, correct?
Well, it did. It's not as much that it opened up the immigration; it's that it made the area more viable for new migrants to make a living, because now with the railroad, the farmers could go from subsistence farming to profitable farming. You know, it was they could get their produce to market. Mm-hmm.
So the railroads are coming in here. There's one story about a slave that was in St. Charles, Archer Alexander, and there's now a memorial in Washington to him, I believe, and he actually, we had a little bit of feuds during the Civil War, and he actually uncovered or overheard a plot to blow up a railroad bridge not too far out around Paruke Creek.
But right, it's near Lake St. Louis up there. It's Paruke Fort was at the edge of Paruke Creek, right? Mm-hmm.
So he warned them, and then of course, it saved a number of lives. I don't think we saw regular Confederate. They were more bushwhackers around here.
Correct.
More than anything else, but it was a bit of a conflicted area around the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And of course, the railroads coming through here made it a much more valuable area, did it not?
Well, it did. It did. But more of the bushwhacking occurred a little to the south of O'Fallon, where the southern sensibilities were a little stronger. How's that for diplomatic?
So we get beyond there, and there's, the Civil War ends, and then there's a lot of development. I didn't realize the Assumption Parish just down the road from here was formed in 1871.
Right. And I'm going to credit Assumption Church with the growth in the town itself. Prior to Assumption Church being formed, parishioners had to travel to either St. Paul or St. Peter's to attend church services. So when some of the local nearby farmers got together to build a church, that's when the population of the town itself grew. And it has historically been a German Catholic town. Now, the German influence... there's a price for that German influence that we've seen at several points in our nation's history. And in fact, O'Fallon's first bank was the German American Bank. And we have some of checks and so forth from the German American Bank. During World War I, that bank changed its name to the Commercial Bank. Despite the heavily German population, they still changed their name. Unfortunately, it did not survive the Great Depression.
Well, and that's a good point. As the German influence was so strong here, by the time we got to World War I, there was mixed allegiance, very much so that I think, people probably did go home, but I think the majority of them stayed here and fought, or joined the army.
I think they were very proud to fight for their new homeland from the letters I've read and the stories I've heard.
So the Assumption Parish kind of opened up the area. It offered a close nearby church for people to attend, but there wasn't a school yet, was there?
No, yes, they did eventually. The nuns, the Sisters of the Most Precious Blood, came to this country from Switzerland, and they began teaching the students when they arrived, and not long after the parish itself was organized. And in fact, O'Fallon's first public school was on the convent grounds. There were a number of one-room schools in the area, but the one in O'Fallon proper was the one I talked about earlier at school in Pittman. So
they built a big school somewhere around 1910. Is that what I understood? A bigger public school, or they were all one rooms up until then, were they not?
No. They still. We didn't have a larger school until the 50s, actually.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
okay,
right, the late 40s.
So there was quite a few local soldiers from the St. Charles County and the O'Fallon area that went and fought in World War II, and several didn't come home. I mean, we got some of the names on the wall. Do you know some of you recognize the names, I'm sure?
I do.
Peter Westhoff.
Peter Westhoff, yes. He was the first, I believe, to come home deceased, to be brought back.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is interesting is, and you saw that actually all over the country when we fought the Germans. Everybody tried to Americanize a little bit more, and then World War II rolls around and the same kind of thing happened. People change their names a lot. It's and after Pearl Harbor, there was one of the things that I read about the area that I thought was just fascinating. Not only O'Fallon but the county, but you see pictures of people doing air raid drills here in O'Fallon. I mean, people were scared after Pearl Harbor.
They were, and the munitions plant in Weldon Springs, I think, fed into that fear a little bit. Now, how they thought the Japanese were going to make it to the middle of the country, I have no idea. But it just tells you what fear will do to you. So, yes, Mayor Paul Westhoff was the organizer for local air raids, and we have newspaper photos of people putting up, the blankets and quilts over the windows and playing cards by candlelight and huddling down during the air raid. We look back at it now and it's just a little comical, when you consider what was going on elsewhere at that time. But nonetheless, that tells you the level of fear.
They even guarded the local bridges and thinking, like you said, they were thinking how they were going to come over here and get in the middle of the country and do something, but it was a real fear that they had. And can you speak to kind of what changed that mindset? Was it some point after the war that things started to change where they weren't so proactive in these fears and things like that? Or
well, I don't know that we here locally were any different from anywhere else around the country. Anytime you have a period of oppression, whether that oppression comes from a ruler or from fear or poverty or anything else. And in fact, we've just seen it after COVID, right? And, there was a spending boom. We started getting back out again, and we were thrilled. And I think that's probably about what happened, in the early 50s when the worst effects of the war were over and prosperity was there. And I've always heard that Dwight Eisenhower was the perfect president for the time. All he did was play golf, so that was what we needed him to do,
I think the one thing I've heard about the area is, of course, when everybody came back from World War II, the baby boomers,
correct.
It was quite the boom. But O'Fallon, this area right around here, it was said that O'Fallon had a lot of churches and a lot of taverns.
Yes.
And I have locals come in here to tell me to this day that there was just countless taverns up and down the streets. And yet I don't know the area as well as you. Do you? I mean, you obviously, you're chuckling. You must have heard the same thing.
Well, I not only heard it, but I could show you a picture of a 5-year-old Pat in a tavern with, the parents. Taverns were taverns were pubs. They were meeting places. Families were in taverns. I grew up in the Methodist community here in O'Fallon, where the consumption of alcohol was a tad more taboo. At least we hid it, to be perfectly honest. The Catholic community imbibed more, quite frankly, and it was a multi-generational thing. It didn't have the evil connotation that we put on it now. And they were gathering places. We didn't really have restaurants in O'Fallon. Even in the 50s, there were maybe a couple of diners. And so the taverns where you went to eat out,
Well, it's the times right after World War II. I think there's probably a whole lot of historians that look at that and try to analyze it. The economy was built for the generation, after that, the jubilant times, and they needed a place to celebrate the end of the war. And
Sure. And there's not only the veteran stories, there's the civilian stories from World War II as well. My own mother talked about ration stamps and, cutting out cardboard cutout to stick in her shoe because with 4 children, or 3 children at that time, she had used up all her leather rationing, right? And she didn't use so much sugar, so this lady who made jelly could take her sugar stamps and give Mom her flour stamps, and that kind of thing. And there's many stories of, for instance, the town dentist, Doc Hibbler. His wife had, I think, 6 or 7 children at the time that Doc went off to war in 42. And her refrigerator went out, and one of the local dealers just showed up with a refrigerator. And that's what you do in a small town. You don't worry about who's paying for it, when, or whatever. If she needs it, she needs it, and that's the end of it. And those are the stories that warm my heart.
Well, they are, and I do think it's a very unique area for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the Veterans Museum, the community really appreciates the veterans. When you look at the county today, in 1970, the population was 7,000, roughly.
Right.
The population at the end of 2021 is 93,644. Yeah. It's a very different area now.
Very
town,
different.
City.
I'll be honest. If I could stand in the middle of Main Street and wind the clock back to 1957, I'd do it in a New York minute. But then on the other hand is we've had many, many wonderful people move to this community. And of course we have the stores and the restaurants that we didn't have. When I was a kid growing up, there were 2 major stores on Main Street. One was Westhoff Mercantile and the other one was Genneman Mercantile. And if they didn't have it, you simply didn't need it,
Now, Westhoff Mercantile, was that McGurk's?
That's the McGurk's building.
McGurk's.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
So there's quite a few of those old buildings still standing around the area.
There's a few. From a historical standpoint, someone like me really envies a city like St. Charles that has so much brick and mortar from an earlier era that people can see, and we have to hang on to our stories here in O'Fallon. Which is why I treasure so much what you guys are doing here at the museum, and you've done a wonderful job, you and Marcia and all the volunteers, preserving the stories, because it's not the war that's important. It's the people who lived through it and fought it and honored it, and that's the same true with the community. It's not about brick and mortar. It's about the men and the women who, in an era before a full city staff, they just simply did what needed to be done. You need street signs. Let's build street signs. You need the road patched. Let's patch the road. And I admire that. Those are the values I grew up with, and that's what I treasure.
The idea of, and I agree with you, St. Charles. Early on, it seems like it was hit or miss whether that area was going to catch on.
Yeah.
But it's really flourishing now.
It is.
It's doing wonderful. Mm-hmm. And it's just not a given. You can take these old buildings and make it into, as successful as St. Charles. And yet we've got a wonderful number of landmark buildings here, but we've not ever quite been able to pull it together.
Right.
Where the museum is located, if there was a historic district, we're 1 block away from what that would be here, but yeah, that almost looks like an impossible mission now.
It does, and boy, that's another whole discussion. You talk about your bucket of worms.
That's a rabbit hole to go down, huh?
Yes, it is.
I guess I just like the idea of preserving. if you can't preserve your heritage, no one will know, the history. And, us, it's our jobs, you and I, people like you, to preserve that. And the young people, I don't want to say that they don't care about that. I don't think they know that they will someday care about that.
I agree. I think it boils down to appreciation and gratitude. You can't be grateful and you can't appreciate what you don't know about, and that's what makes a community. That's what makes service.
A lot of history in the city of O'Fallon, and you mentioned that at one point it felt very small and small town like, right? Mm-hmm. But it still has that small town feel, and the city of O'Fallon is very friendly, especially to veterans and their causes, amongst other things. But what do you think, maybe to correlate historically with the present, why the city of O'Fallon is so entrenched in the values and that they are, and how that represents with veterans?
I think it's what I just mentioned. It's gratitude. There's no assumptions. There's no entitlement. There's a work ethic in the Midwest, I think, that you may not find in other parts of the country. Nothing's handed out here, and I honor that. I respect that, and I think when you realize what the people who went before you have done. Well, I always say that hearing those stories, whether it's a veteran story or a mayor's story or a homemaker with ration stamps, that story, those stories plant seeds when a kid hears them, I believe. And that seed becomes a question. And the question is, how can I serve? What can I do? What role do I play? And that's why I think it's so important to hold these stories.
Very well said.
So, Pat, I just to make sure I got it straight, I want to kind of recap the historic little buildings that I had no clue of their importance just days before. So we got an ice cream shop that used to be a one-room slave schoolhouse.
Well, African American.
Yes. We've got the Arnold Krekel House. That's a bridal shop now.
Nicholas Krekel's.
Nicholas Krekel's house.
Yes, that one. Mm-hmm.
We've got McGurk's.
Right.
It's closed now, but it used to be the
Westoff Mercantile.
Okay, right. And then we got Fort Zumwalt, which isn't really a fort. It's the house that was like a fort for Jacob Zumwalt. we're saying.
Right.
Just a mile from here, we've got the Heald House.
Heald House, we haven't talked about that. Stony Point.
Stony Point, it's called.
Right, and Darius Heald lived in the fort for the rest, except for the last decade and a half of his life. In the late 1880s, he built the brick house called Stony Point.
And we got a log cabin. Who were the original builder of the log cabin?
Well, we don't know who originally built it. It had a string of owners from about 1860 till the turn of the century. And it was, you're referring to the Historical Society's Log Cabin Museum, right?
Yes.
It's in Civic Park. And it originally stood near where the Schnucks is, at the corner of Veterans Memorial and Highway K. And when the supermarket, I think it was National actually, that purchased that property in the early 70s to build a supermarket, they started to tear the farmhouse down, which at that time was in the ownership of the Patton family. Now, that's the Patton, Linda Patton Wilmus, the artist who has done so much wonderful work here, her family farm. And when they started to tear it down, they took the clapboard siding off and discovered a log cabin underneath it, which was not uncommon. When they moved to the frontier, they used the materials they had, and as they prospered, they upgraded, right? So at any rate, they contacted the city. An alderman at the time, Raleigh Jessup, was forming the Historical Society. So when you pull into Fort Zumwalt Park, you will see Jessup Drive. That's Raleigh Jessup. His passion for years was the reconstruction of that fort. But at any rate, they got permission to tear it down log by log and move it. City gave them permission to move it to Civic Park. And so it became the museum. And what we're most proud of is the fact that everything in that museum is from O'Fallon. It's not something that we bought, the society bought for someplace else in an antique shop and moved it here. So, again, the stories. I can take you through the Log Cabin Museum and I can tell you the stories of almost everything in there.
So you got the Sage Chapel African American Cemetery
Right.
on the historic register, correct?
Yes. Yes.
We've got the Sisters of the Precious Blood Abbey, which I guess that goes. I was in it for the first time.
Oh, really?
About a week ago. I spoke to some of the residents there, and I'd never been in it, and I went in the chapel, and it's pretty beautiful.
St. Joseph's Chapel is amazing, is it not?
It is.
Yes.
And then you got Assumption Parish. So there's probably more that I haven't even thought of, but there's a lot of history here, and you could spend a great deal of time. You could organize a bus trip, and I guess that's one of my visions is, can you do a bus trip just around the area here, load people up and show them all these things? So.
Well, one of the things that I'd love to see done, since we haven't preserved as much as I would like us to have preserved, is some kind of a moving slide presentation. So if a person is standing on this street corner, they can look at a device that shows them what it looked like in 1922 or whatever. Mm-hmm. I think that would be a fun project.
Absolutely.
I think it's. I think it might still be on YouTube if you want to go looking. I worked with the city of O'Fallon to produce a video called "Tales from a Small Town," and we did a lot of just exactly that. This was the site of, so forth and so forth. It was a fun project.
Mm-hmm. How many generations of your family are from O'Fallon?
I'm the first. My generation is the first. My parents moved down here from Minnesota in 1942. My father, like many other men at the time, got a job at the Weldon Springs plant, munitions plant. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And that's certainly a colorful story in itself about the munitions factory when the government came in and displaced residents of 3 different towns there.
Yeah.
It'd be a great story to tell sometime. And, the atomic, I guess it was TNT during World War II, but then the Cold War, it was...
Mallinckrodt Chemical did a great deal of research that is questionable in its effectiveness and some disastrous results for the people who work there. But my father's role. Well, he got a job originally working on the roads, building the roads, but then they understood he was in refrigeration work previously, so he worked in keeping the temperature control on some of the ammunition depots.
So, again, St. Charles County, it's quite a history, including the TNT factory. I guess they guarded the bridge after Pearl Harbor because that TNT factory.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's what precipitated the raids, the blackout drills.
Well, that's an interesting kind of correlation there.
It is. It is. I think that stoked the fears that with the munitions.
That brings it to light a little bit more for maybe the listeners that there was something that needed to be guarded in their minds. And so it wasn't just this random fear. It was a legitimate fear of what was actually happening around here.
It was, and it wasn't just so much a matter of guarding it as it put the residents, the citizens of the county in danger.
Absolutely.
By having a target on it, essentially.
Now, it was that munitions plant near, I'm supposed that was probably near a railroad. No.
It's,
okay.
It's the area that is primarily bush conservation area.
Oh, okay.
In fact, you can still see some of the ammunition bunkers throughout that property.
Okay. I'm going to have to check that out. I never even knew that was there. So I'm learning something new.
It is a great story. It's a sad story in a way because you had these 3 towns that pretty much the government and said, you're moving. You don't like the offer, you're moving.
Right. Eminent domain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Howell, Tuner, and
Mechanicsburg.
Yeah. So there was actually 4 towns.
4 towns, yeah.
Wow.
But it was the time we were in, and I guess you could say that, here in St. Charles County, we've been in unique times throughout the history, going back to forts that weren't really forts.
Right. Well, you're a published author, and among them, you've written O'Fallon, A Great Place to Live, 1856 to 2003. Can you tell us a little bit about your books?
Well, actually, I'm not the principal author. I did contribute. I'm a contributing author on that book.
Okay.
That was a project that we undertook for the sesquicentennial celebration in 2006. The committee for which I chaired. I kid that I got the job because I knew how to spell sesquicentennial. But after that project, I ended up working with the publishing company that published that book for us as what they call a contract author. So in other words, if an organization or a company wanted their history written, but they didn't have someone internal, they would contract with me to do it. And so, with some research and some interviews, right up my alley, right? 'Cause I love stories. I love to listen to people's stories, and I love to tell people's stories for them, because the most rewarding thing for me in that work was to sit down with people. And when you first start to interview them, I didn't do anything. I don't remember that much of that, I didn't have anything to do with that. And after about 30 minutes of engaged, prying, all of a sudden it just pours out. And it's wonderful to watch that happen. I enjoyed that. So a total of 25 books on everything from country clubs to universities to boat manufacturers, glove manufacturers, fraternities, sororities, and my favorite group to write for were the rural electric cooperatives. I did a total of 7 across the country, and again, Midwestern values. You're rural. You don't have the service that you need desperately, and so guess what? We get together and we build it ourselves, and I just love that mentality.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I'm hearing you say, and I couldn't agree more, is preserving history. And very often I have these discussions with people that come into museum, and they start telling me about their grandpa, their uncles, and that. And I said, have you got this wrote down anywhere and written down? And they say no. And I said, well, when are you going to start?
Yeah, right.
Because you're right. The very first step is starting them talking,
right.
And then very often it just goes from there. But it's kind of a plea that I would put out there and say, we have military veterans. You have military veterans in your family. How long are you going to wait to start preserving their stories?
Well, I think people are intimidated by the process of putting words together, and I wish they didn't feel like that, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your syntax is right or your spelling is all right. It doesn't matter. Just put it down.
Well, and I agree with that completely. There's people like you, and like I think Marcia here and me, and that just
Becomes,
let them babble. It's okay.
Yeah.
We'll capture it, and we can weave it into a story, and I think that's important, just to get the story out, and I think you're dead on, Pat.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you can think of that you'd like to share with us?
Well, what just came to mind was my own mother, actually. She passed away last year at 101. And as she reached the end of her life, and, what happened last week was escaping her. But 1932, she could remember perfectly. And so I would spend afternoons with her, writing all that down. And after she passed, then I put it all together with photos, and that's her story, and gave it to each of her grandchildren, in a binder. And I would like to encourage everybody to do that, because I discovered years and years and years ago when I started in genealogy, doing my own family's genealogy. And I could go back to the 1600s, but all I had were names and dates. And I thought, I don't know anything about these people. I don't know what they did for a living. I don't know if they were rich or poor. I don't know what they did for fun. Did they farm? I don't know. I know nothing about them. And so maybe, people get discouraged because they say, oh, my kids don't care about that. Well, guess what? Their kids and their kids and their kids just might, because we tend to think of history. History gains its value with time. So put the stories down.
Great feedback.
Powerful advice. Thank you so much, Pat, for joining us today in the studio here to really just share some history of O'Fallon, and thank you for your passion of preserving history for us. And we're going to go ahead and sign off of the Dog Tag Podcast from the St. Charles County Veterans Museum. The Dog Tag is brought to you by the St. Charles County Veterans Museum. The museum is a 501c3 nonprofit business. Do you like our podcast? With your support, we'll continue to bring you great programming. If you'd like to donate, go to sccvetsmuseum.org and click on Donate. Join us next time on the Dog Tag Podcast from the St. Charles County Veterans Museum as we welcome Sergeant Benjamin DeMullen and Staff Sergeant David Berger. Beginning in 1973, America went to an all-volunteer military service. An all-volunteer military isn't without challenges. Today, the branches of services are struggling to find able-bodied recruits. According to the CDC, an estimated 70% of young Americans are unfit for military service. Historically, family life has not always worked for military families, and roughly 20% of the military are women. Others say the combination of low unemployment and the ease of finding private sector jobs means fewer young people join the service. The Marines are likely the only branch of service to make their quota in 2022. Join us next week when our guest will be Sergeant Benjamin DeMullen and Staff Sergeant David Berger, local St. Louis recruiters.